Hey everyone, this is Stephen Nelson from Cross Bible, and I just want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who has subscribed to the Cross Bible official YouTube channel and everyone who has registered on our Bible study platform. If you haven't done that yet, go over to crossbible.com and register for free. We have over 30 Bibles, including the NASB, the NIV, and we're getting the ESV and the NRSV very, very shortly. So thank you so much to all of our patrons who are supporting our mission to build these Bible study features and provide this service for free, but also to expand our features and enrich your Bible study experience. Now, the video you're about to see is actually an interview from the channel What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You, which is Zach Miller. Thank you so much to Zach for giving me permission to feature this video on our channel, which is a demo of the Timeline of the Bible feature, which you can explore right now at crossbible.com, and you can even order a poster. So I hope you like the video, and please make sure to like and subscribe and go over there and register and study the Bible with us. All right, thanks. Hope you enjoy it.
Stephen has created what I would say is a pretty revolutionary way of thinking about the timeline of the ancient texts that could be a really great resource that we're going to talk about today, as well as just textual criticism and understanding the text that we have. So before we get into that, before we dive into the whole manuscript history, can you give us just a quick overview of what Cross Bible is and why it's important for understanding textual history?
Yeah, so Cross Bible is a Bible study platform that I founded last year, basically, and we launched the first version of it in October of 2024. Initially with a collection of about 20 Bibles that were just in the public domain. It was sort of the minimum viable product that I was able to throw together. And then gradually we grew the collection. So I think we're up to like 35 Bibles right now. We just recently got the NASB from the Lockman Foundation. Thank you very much, Lockman Foundation. We got the NIV very recently from Biblica. So those two versions are available for comparison. And we just got the licenses from Crossway for the ESV and from the National Council of Christian Churches for the, there we go, for the NRSV updated edition, which we will have on very, very soon. So we're acquiring new Bibles like crazy and getting licenses, and the publishers are all very, enthusiastic to share their Bibles with us. It's all 100% free. But I do have, if you go on and register, eventually the registration is going to open up certain capabilities like taking notes that you'll be saved into your next session. So you can always pull up your notes for certain verses that persist across all Bible versions. And then like highlighting and things that they're listed on the homepage, these features that are currently in development. I have developers working on things and fixing bugs constantly. So if you have any feedback, you can reach out to us through the homepage. If there's any, if you notice any errors or you just want to say something nice, or if you want to sign up for Greek classes, I teach private Greek lessons online, and also the contact form does that.
Awesome. Okay, so let's get into that. So we have the three main, I don't know, text types is probably not the right word, but the sources of where we get the Bible. So we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Masoretic text, and the Septuagint. And maybe we can talk about a little bit extra on top of that. But could you just let's talk about each individual one. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, what are they? Why are they significant? And can you show it on your timeline?
Yeah, so why don't you pop up the timeline? And the term text type is text-type is a term that is used in Old Testament textual criticism. So I have it here as this is mostly based on the work of Emanuel Tove, because his book, Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, is really foundational, and I learned a lot from it. So I wanted this timeline to kind of represent everything basically over the last decade when I've been studying this topic. Whenever I come across a piece of information, I have plugged it into this. And I didn't launch it until October of 2024, but this is really like a decade of sort of self-study. This was the sort of repository for all this information that I was learning. And now it's just publicly available. And I'm crowdsourcing information. So sometimes people will leave comments Kip Davis had a lot of helpful input on the Old Testament portion of this. So the text types, which sometimes they're called textual families for the Old Testament, are typically divided between the Hebrew Masoretic text family with MT, the Septuagint, which could also be conceived of as a family, although a very a broken family with abbreviated LXX, which is the Roman numeral for 70, and then the Samaritan Pentateuch SP. Those are the three text types. There is not a text type for the Dead Sea Scrolls. So even though you see references like to DSS, that is not considered a text type in and of itself. That is a collection of texts that usually, the individual manuscripts in that in the collection could be categorized in a specific family or text type. Here you have the list of the different books, right? So you have the Old Testament canon, the canonical books that are just in sort of every run-of-the-mill Bible and in the sort of standard divisions and classifications. But then you have some differences between the way that books are named and categorized in the LXX and the Septuagint. And then you, of course, have deuterocanonical books, the Apocrypha, a lot of which were originally composed in Greek. So you can see this green color represents the Septuagint specific books. And then, of course, you have the Enochian literature, Jubilees, the Maccabean literature. A lot of these are original Greek compositions, not translations from Hebrew, but they're included in typical collections of the text we call the Septuagint. So they get associated with the Septuagint, even though if you're strictly defining Septuagint as the translation of the Hebrew of the Pentateuch, really, then these books would not be admissible under that strict definition. So the definition is very fuzzy and flexible and imprecise, and a lot of people complain about it, including the scholars that use it, but they don't have any other way to classify it. The Dead Sea Scrolls we have in the timeline represented in this dark gray color to signify that first of all, there's a pretty wide time range where these fit into, right? So we have the earliest dated manuscripts in the 3rd century BC, going all the way into the 2nd century AD, where this huge collection of texts is dated. Now, you and I have discussed this, and I do have aspirations to break out additional, either expanding this timeline or breaking out separate timelines so that you would actually see the individual Dead Sea Scrolls, 4Q, Deuteronomy, and all the individual manuscripts. So far, right now, what you see is just a big block that's like doing a lot of work, right? That's a huge umbrella basically for the Dead Sea Scrolls to indicate that they're not brown colored to represent the Masoretic text. It's gray and it's mixed text types. So you have MT plus, MT-like texts that have affinities to the later medieval Masoretic text. You have the Hebrew manuscripts that match more or less the readings that we have in the Septuagint. So those are LXX text types, and you have copies that are actually in Greek, a few fragments, and you have Hebrew texts that more closely resemble the Samaritan Pentateuch. So the fact that this is mixed means that we don't have a Dead Sea Scrolls text type. We have a collection in the Dead Sea Scrolls spanning a long period of time with lots of different versions of the Bible. It would be like if you discovered a library that had the King James in it, and it had the NIV, and it had all these different versions of the Bible. That's what we get in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We get lots of different versions of the Old Testament, which seems to indicate that this particular community didn't have any textual biases, right? They weren't like, oh, we're going to ignore these Hebrew manuscripts that are sort of that resemble the Greek translations, or that match effectively the implication of having a Hebrew manuscript in the Dead Sea Scrolls that has a reading that agrees with the Septuagint against the Proto-Masoretic text family implies that whatever text was back here, the source of the Septuagint, whatever Hebrew would have been behind these translations here, the Old Greek Septuagint, we have either copies of that Hebrew text or just very, very closely related ones in the Dead Sea Scroll cache, right? We have it here in these LXX versions. Whereas there is a separate in the Judean desert, right? The discoveries in the Judean desert scrolls. This particular collection, which also has a pretty wide date range. I don't know if it really goes back this far, but this is all MT plus, right? This is like basically that whoever compiled that collection of texts did seem to have a particular preference or bias, or maybe it's coincidental. The only manuscripts they found in the discoveries in the Judean desert actually match more or less the type of text that we find in the later medieval Masoretic text. So here you have a collection of Masoretic family scrolls, right? And then here you have a collection of just everything under the sun, right? You have a lot of textual diversity, textual plurality, a sort of, if these were Essenes, you have to say that, okay, well, these Essenes didn't seem to have a preference for the text that was clearly preferred by the Pharisees, right? The Pharisaic text was the Proto-Masoretic text. So, and that happens to be the version of the Bible that was preserved after the fall of the temple and into the beginning of Rabbinic Judaism. The transition from Second Temple period into Rabbinic Judaism, where we start getting the Talmud, right? The Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Gemara, and the Babylonian Gemara to complete the Talmud. That was already in a period where Hebrew was a liturgical language, and the preferred form of the text that they were using, that they were making this commentary on, was the Proto-Masoretic text. And that carries forward on the timeline all the way into the medieval period, where you finally get, in this brown color, the medieval Masoretic text proper. It was probably compiled in this period, but this isn't a manuscript here. This is just a heading. And over here is the 10th and 11th century codices that, the Aleppo Codex, and most famously the Leningrad Codex, which you can always click on these information panels and read more information about that. The Masoretic text is this, right? So these representatives, these manuscripts from the 10th and 11th century, especially Codex Leningradensis, right? The Leningrad Codex. This is the Masoretic text proper. In other words, it's the culmination of this tradition by the Masoretes of really meticulous copying of older sources and applying, the vowel pointing, diacritical marks, and sort of marking up the text basically with the Masorah to indicate exactly how things were supposed to be read out loud and pronounced, right? And so when the older tradition only had consonants, they were filling them in with vowels. They were sort of making the text come into its final form, which we now call MT Masoretic text. So there are people, this is like a printed edition, right? The Mikraot Gedelot. This is the Tanakh, right? The Hebrew Bible. And then today we have critical editions of it. There are people who will say that because the Masoretic text is defined as this medieval tradition, that it really isn't appropriate, or at least it's somewhat confusing, to refer to this back here as MT, right? Because the implication that this all the way back here is Proto-Masoretic. The idea is this is the proto version. This is the first version, proto, behind what would later be the Masoretic text. So what this is not claiming that in the 4th century BC, there were Masoretes, right? The Masoretes did not exist yet. So inevitably there are people that go into the comments that say that the Masoretes didn't exist until the medieval period. We understand that, right? Like, this is the way that scholars describe this text type, with the word Masoretic, with the word Proto-Masoretic, or sometimes they'll call it the Masoretic family, right? So this is the tradition that reaches back this far in this particular stream of transmission, that is isolated from this stream of transmission that got translated into Greek and disappeared in the Hebrew for the most part, with the exception of the Nash Papyrus has some readings that match it, and the Dead Sea Scrolls have it.
Yeah, there was one other thing I wanted you to mention, the Nash Papyrus there.
Yeah.
Where does that fit in all this?
It's a collection of 4 Hebrew papyrus fragments. I'm just reading the description, right? It has the 10 Commandments. It's fragmentary. But the text diverges from the later Masoretic text, and in some passages aligns more closely with the Septuagint. So before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, right, before the 1940s and before they were published, really, it was a reasonable inference to assume that that the Masoretic text was the best thing we had, right? Even though it was late, even though it went to the medieval period, when they dug up, when the Nash Papyrus was discovered, what it really pointed to was the idea that it was possible to find Hebrew texts that agreed with the Septuagint, right? And the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls really blew the lid off of this, because now finally we had Hebrew that it more or less agreed with the Septuagint in certain spots. And we'll look, I pulled up one example on the slideshow to go over. But that's the idea, is that the Nash Papyrus is a small sample of this phenomenon of like, oh wow, we have Hebrew that matches the Greek. That's interesting, because before the conclusion was just that the Greek must have been corrupt, mistranslated. It was not really the early church that was constantly revising. These right here are the revisions to the Septuagint. These revisions of the Septuagint, they're marked MT in the timeline, because they're taking the Greek, the older Greek that was translated from a different Hebrew source. They're comparing it to the Proto-Masoretic text that the Jews are using, early Christians, and they're saying, all right, there's something wrong here, right? Like this is, if our Greek translation is a translation of the original Hebrew, and the original Hebrew is defined as the Masoretic text, well, we need to revise our Hebrew towards the Masoretic text. We need to correct it. In some cases, that was appropriate when it was clearly mistranslated. Like, okay, the Greek translator here missed some meaning in the Hebrew, and we need to fix it. That happens. But there were other times where they were correcting the Septuagint, in these revisions or recensions, right? We have Aquila, Symmachus, Origen's Hexapla, Hesychius, Lucian, Theodotion. These corrections were very often just corrupting the earlier Greek tradition, right? Like they weren't necessary, that would have gone back to some original Hebrew text that was fundamentally different from the Proto-Masoretic tradition. There were two different Hebrew versions that were in competition, and the trail of the paper trail here got obscured by these later correctors or resenders who were resending the Septuagint towards the Masoretic text, and effectively just kind of like erasing the original Christian Old Testament. It was a Jewish Old Testament, but the ones that the Christians originally used.
Right. Yeah. So I'm sure there might be people watching like, okay, what happened in the middle? Because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we got maybe a text here or there, Hebrew. Then all of a sudden, over like 1,000 years later or something, you have all these Masoretes writing in Hebrew. So
In the middle between, okay, I see what you mean.
yeah,
So in the middle here.
is that just a lot of text just didn't survive? I mean, obviously the Dead Sea Scrolls are a very special thing because the way they were preserved.
Yeah, we basically don't have manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible that date after the Dead Sea Scrolls. 4th century AD got nothing. 5th century got nothing. 6th century, nothing, just boom, boom, boom. And then we know that the Masoretes were working in this period of this, from the 7th century, 8th century, 9th century AD. This is when they were active, and they were taking these older sources that were probably in an unbroken chain, right? They had some manuscripts they were working from, but the only ones that survive are from the 10th and 11th centuries. So we know that these are copies of older copies that are copies of older copies. We know that there was probably a chain where every century there would be, you would get maybe every couple centuries a manuscript would go out of use, right? It would just crumble up, right? But you could copy it and pass it on. So we just don't have a clean chain, basically like an unbroken chain. We have later copies way over here of a much, much earlier text that probably did go through a transmission process with lots of links in the chain. But the remarkable thing that we're going to go over from, looking at the observations of Emanuel Tove is that these copies that we do have here from the Judean desert and included in the Dead Sea Scroll collection are copies of more or less the same kind of text, the same text type that we end up with in the medieval period in the Leningrad Codex, right? Like the level of fidelity here, thanks to the meticulous scribal practices of the Masoretes and the sort of reverence that they had for the Hebrew Bible, we just get very, very close copying, right? We get a level of scribal perfection, right? Perfectionism that we just don't really observe when we turn this chapter in the video into the New Testament. We don't see that kind of clean scribal practice in the transmission of the New Testament, which is a little bit more of like, little more chaotic.
Yeah. Yeah. So, of course, there's the Septuagint. You mentioned there's the Samaritan Pentateuch. We'll
Yeah.
get into those, but there's more on the Dead Sea Scrolls you wanted to talk about, right?
Yeah, I mean, we could jump into the slide a little bit if you want to present the slide. So go to slide 2, and you can see here, this is an example for Deuteronomy Q, where you have lines that are probably just missing from the Hebrew Masoretic text. That whatever parent text of the Leningrad Codex, going back many centuries, there was probably a point where, when you go back to the furthest ancestor that we can't reach to in that tradition, that these lines were there. I don't. The citation is to Tov's Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, 249 to 250. You can go and read his speculation or his inference on why he thinks that these were dropped out of the Masoretic tradition, that in the process of sort of editing and revision of the Masoretic text, the idea of the references to "and let all the sons of God do obeisance to him," right? The sons of God, which is reflected in this. So this is the thing: this copy, this fragment in the Dead Sea Scrolls is mirroring the Septuagint against the Masoretic text. And the scholarly consensus, if you look into any commentaries or scholarly sources on this, they all agree that the poetic nature of this passage does require some of these lines to be there, right? So let all the sons of God do obeisance to him, be glad, O nations, with his people, and let all the angels of God prevail for him. So angels of God, sons of God. This is referring to angelic beings. And Tove posits, along with many other people, that this may have just been a little too uncomfortable for some early scribe in the Masoretic period who may have intentionally just taken them out because he wanted to center the focus on what we end up with in the Masoretic text, which is be glad, O nations, with his people. He'll avenge the blood of his servants, wreak revenge and repay his foes, and he will cleanse his land, his people. The focus here is on Israel and not on angelic beings, right? That this was a monotheistic revision. That this change was motivated by somebody who didn't feel comfortable with the perceived either polytheism or henotheism, or just the plurality of divine beings or angelic beings. This is like, I'm just sort of paraphrasing Tove's thesis on this, that this was actually intentionally left out. It's above my pay grade to speculate on what the reason. All we have now is just sort of, these two different versions, right? We have the Dead Sea Scroll version that's reflecting the Septuagint version. So you could say that this is like an LXX reading, right? This is a Septuagintal reading, and it is most likely more original, right? Like when textual critics of the Hebrew Bible reconstruct what they think was the original text, that's the version that they're going with. And go to the next slide. I can show you just sort of the conclusion. And this is all. There's another slide where I have a table. I think maybe you skip. Yeah, that one. Okay. So and this is in this is all just described in much more detail in a video on Cross Bible about the Old Testament, Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint. But you can see here that like between another textual variant like this is in Deuteronomy 32:8, right? So this is all in the Song of Moses. So you can see that like short version versus long version, right? If you go with the scholarly consensus, you conclude that, okay, the long versions here, the Septuagint readings here are actually more likely original, and that they are better objectively with respect to the textual criticism. They are better than the Masoretic text in this instance. And so you can see that like KJV, NKJV, CSB, NIV, and NASB, they are printing the shorter versions, going against that scholarly consensus in deference to the Masoretic text. They are translating the Masoretic text, and they are sort of ignoring the scholarship, or they're ignoring the Septuagint in this case. They're favoring the Masoretic text over the Septuagint. There are other Bibles, MSG, NET, NRSV, ESV, NLT, that in Deuteronomy 32:8 are actually printing in the body of the text. They're printing the longer versions, the Septuagint versions. So even though their Old Testaments are very much like in line with the Masoretic text, that is what those editors consider to be the original text. In specific instances like this, where the weight of the evidence seems to just really favor the Septuagint, that the Septuagint is translating a Hebrew original that's closer to the Dead Sea Scrolls, that what we find, they're printing the longer version. But in 3243, where the Masoretic text is considered deficient, several lines, they're a little more hesitant, right? The NET, the MSG, they're still not going that far, right? You only get that in the NRSV, the ESV, and the NLT, and you can see which ones have footnotes that actually alert you to this fact. So this is from an article that he wrote, and this is an interesting quote that you flagged as well. And I mentioned this, on another podcast. We are able to demonstrate that the text found in the medieval manuscripts is exactly the same as the text found in the Judean desert in scrolls of 2,000 years old. This text hasn't changed for 2 millennia, and this is almost a miracle, not a divine miracle. It's very secular, not a divine miracle, but a man-made miracle, since the so-called Masoretes, keepers of the Masorah, carefully guarded the Masoretic text against changes. So this is a really, now I think I have a sort of response in here from Kip Davis. This is obviously a very maximalist, a triumphalist kind of like declaration of the sort of fidelity of the later Masoretic text to this earlier tradition in terms of the consonantal framework, right? So I think go to the next slide and we'll get that point, right? The consonantal framework of this text is nearly identical to the non-Qumran Judean Desert Scrolls and has been more or less frozen since at least the 3rd century BC. That's from Textual Criticism. And then if you go to the next slide after that, I think I have a
just
little.
wanted to mention, Steve.
Okay, go ahead.
Wes Huff is just so excited right now.
Well, I wish he were excited about this. I mean, this is what he should have pointed at, right? But then you get to the clincher, right? So what Wes Huff did was he was pointing at one specific manuscript and saying it was word for word identical to the later Masoretic text, which was objectively not true, and he admitted that was a hyperbolic statement, right? Now you could also accuse Emanuel Tov of making a hyperbolic statement, but in retrospect, like if I were in Wes Huff's shoes and I wanted to sit there and tell and impress this fact upon Joe Rogan and make him say, "Wow!" Right? It was not worthwhile to point at that one manuscript. What he should have pointed at is point at the Judean Desert Scrolls, right? Like say like scholars were shocked and amazed at to discover that there were proto-Masoretic texts, like in the plural, floating around in that time period as early as then that had at least the consonants matching almost identically to the later Masoretic text. Like you could frame it that way and at least be in line with the scholarship, and maybe some scholars would pick that apart and say, well, and they'll talk about textual variants and stuff like that. But at least then you'd be in the realm of sort of plausibility, and then you could. And all that really does is it tells you that the top of the timeline that I have with the brown over here and then the lines pointing at the brown over here, all it means is that from the medieval period is transmitting the earlier tradition across that line very, very accurately, right? At least the consonants, right? Maybe the added vowels in the medieval period that sort of that tweak things a little bit, but the consonants, they were all transmitted accurately. But that's one textual tradition. That's one stream of transmission. Then you get to the next quote where Emanuel Tov affirms, when evaluating the quality of the Masoretic text, one should realize that the preference for the Masoretic text, in other words, this is the MT-only paradigm, is what it's sometimes referred to, within Judaism, does not necessarily imply that it contains the best earliest evidence of the scripture text. Both the Hebrew parent text of the Septuagint and several Qumran manuscripts reflect excellent texts, often better and or earlier than the Masoretic text. Readings of the Masoretic text are often preferable to those found in other texts, but this statistical information should not influence decisions in individual instances like Deuteronomy 32:43 and Deuteronomy 32:8, because the exceptions to this situation are not predictable. Furthermore, the Masoretic text is no more reliable than the Septuagint or certain Qumran texts. The application of this rule reflects an inappropriate preference for the Masoretic text. So textual critics believe that the sort of default knee-jerk preference for the Masoretic text, this is the final form, this is the only version of the Bible according to the Protestant tradition, right? Like if you're a Protestant, you tend to believe that. You kind of have to open up your aperture a little bit and like bring in some other stuff, which gets you into the Septuagint, and it gets you into the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it gets you into accepting other sources as weighing against the Masoretic text in certain key situations, in certain books, in certain chapters, and certain verses. If you go onto the Cross Bible homepage, you'll see this illustration of Luke 4:18. It's one of my favorite examples of Jesus going into a synagogue and reading from a scroll of Isaiah. And this is a feature that I'm working on right now, where the cross references, when they're displayed in this modal window that I'm trying to design so that it opens up sort of somewhere to the side of the text that you're comparing it to, so you can line them up. I want that to display the Septuagint, either in the Greek or in an English translation or some other translation, so that you can see specifically in instances like this, that when Jesus is reading from a version of Isaiah that we no longer have in Hebrew or Aramaic or whatever, if he's reading from a Hebrew text, he seems to be reading a text that, according to Luke, who's writing in Greek, who is referencing the Greek Septuagint, he's reading from a text that says recovery of sight to the blind, right? Tiflis anablepsin in Greek. So that is in the text of Luke, pointing at the text of Isaiah 61:1, that when we look at the Hebrew, it does not have anything related to restoring sight of the blind. But when we look at the Greek, it has tiflis anablepsin, which matches Jesus's quotation. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a little bit clearer illustration of what's going on here. So Luke 4:18 is quoting verbatim. Jesus is reading from the top of Isaiah 61, and it says recovery of sight to the blind. And if you look at the NASB, which is translating from the Masoretic text, they are not, just in deference to the quotation from Luke, none of these Bibles is going to print recovery of sight to the blind until they unearth some Hebrew manuscript that proves that it was there, right? Like they're going with the Masoretic tradition. That is like the default quote unquote standard Bible. But seems like there would be something missing there if you sort of give credence to the Septuagint as potentially representing an older Hebrew text. There are other explanations, but that's what I'm going with. And then if you look a little further in the next slide, you can see comparing the NASB's Old Testament with Brenton, which is a translation of Codex Alexandrinus, Vaticanus. You will see in recovery of sight to the blind, right? Like they match. So it's helpful when comparing quotations in the New Testament to quotations of the Old Testament to at least check the Septuagint, or a translation of the Septuagint if you don't know Greek, because that tends to be the version, with a few exceptions, that tends to be the version that the New Testament authors are quoting.
Right, so that's very important to recognize there.
The original Pentateuch, the original first 5 books of the Torah, was translated most likely into Greek for the first time in the 3rd century BC, and this is strictly what people very often mean when they refer to the Septuagint, the 70, right, or the 72. Mm-hmm. They're referring to this legend in the letter of Aristeas of these 72 Hebrew scholars in Alexandria, Egypt, who translated from the Hebrew into Greek, and all of their translations reportedly came out perfect. This would have been this event somewhere around here that would only focus on the first 5 books, right? We didn't have the prophets, we didn't have the writings, we didn't have additional material until later, late 3rd century, 2nd century BC. It's believed that there was the Old Greek Septuagint expansion process of the original Hebrew sources, and maybe some of them align more closely with the Masoretic text, but some of them may have been part of this other Hebrew tradition, where it was all finished by the first century BC, right? There isn't hard evidence for this, right? Like there are people who will dispute this idea, but what we observe in later tradition is are textual witnesses to what's called the Kaige Theodotian revision. And this is a bit of a misnomer, but basically this revision, the Kaige, Kaige or Keia in Greek, refers to and indeed in Greek, right? That's what Keia means or Kaige means. So what we noticed is that whoever produced these particular Greek translations or revisions of the previous Greek translations, they were taking an older form of Greek, they were updating it most of the time to agree with the Proto-Masoretic text against, like they were revising the Greek to make it a bit more Jewish, right? Or make it a bit more like aligned with the Pharisaic text, right? So whoever produced this, and it had nothing to do with Theodotion, but the name got assigned. Whoever did it had a little signature, which was beginning sentences with kaige, 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 and indeed, and indeed, and indeed. And that's why this particular revision, it's called the kaige version. And later, what scholars realized is that much later in this timeline, sometime around the 2nd century AD, there was a Theodosian revision, which also was done towards the Masoretic text that was distinct from kaige, but the name stuck. So even though Theodotion had nothing to do with this one, typically because these revisions were sort of conflated, we distinguish, we say Kaige Theodotion, right? So that's what this line is right here. They are basically corruptions of the earlier Greek tradition towards the Masoretic text, so that the Greek would more closely resemble the Hebrew, right? Like it was just the problem was very simple. We got Greek. It doesn't always match the Hebrew. Let's update the Greek to match the Hebrew. That was Aquila's project. That was Symmachus's project. That was to some extent Origen's project when he compiled the Hexapla, even though he was comparing all the different versions. There was still the prevalent opinion at that time. Hesychius, Lucian, all of these revisers or these resenders, people who are producing these recensions of the Septuagint, were all shared the opinion that the Hebrew text that was circulating among the Jews, that a lot of them couldn't even read, must be the quote unquote original, right? Like they weren't thinking about the idea of different text types, that, because they didn't know about the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? They didn't know that there were these caves that had Hebrew versions that would have matched their Greek text. If they had known that, if the rabbinic Jews after the fall of the temple would have preserved those texts and sort of been supportive of this dual tradition in the Hebrew, maybe they would have kept the older Greek versions and they would have just preserved those, because they would realize that, oh, what we have here is actually really valuable. We have a Greek translation of this older source that's been lost. They didn't know that. They were just completely unaware. What they did know is that they had like huge sections, and this is in the correspondence between Origen and Africanus, where Africanus is saying, there are sections of Daniel, and you can see here, Papyrus 967 has OG Daniel, right? It's the old Greek version of Daniel, which if you look at this part right here, you can see the prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Holy Children, Susanna and Bell and the Dragon. These are Greek additions to Daniel, right? So they had the canonical Hebrew Daniel, they had the old Greek translation of it, and then at some point, people were slipping in additional material into Daniel that was considered spurious, that was not in the original Hebrew, may have had some kind of underlying Hebrew source or a tradition, at least, of the narrative in the Danielic traditional literature, and we find a lot of that in Qumran. People just were not aware of the fact that there was actually some text critical value in the Septuagint until much later. So once you get to the period where you have the modern critical editions of the Septuagint, you have the Ralph Hanhart Septuagint from the German Bible Society. Now we're in the era of modern day Septuagintal studies, where people acknowledge the fact that, oh yeah, we know that the Septuagint was corrupted, And we are trying, the scholars are trying to restore what would have been the old Greek version. And in some cases, when you read the Septuagint, like a printed version, it will have like the Theodosian Daniel and then the OG Daniel, right? Because they're represented in different manuscripts and different textual traditions. And the Septuagint is just really corrupt, right? Is we have the opposite. The opposite is the case for the Masoretic text, right? For the Masoretic text, we have extreme continuity, we have extreme accuracy and consistency in that tradition. It's just the Septuagint tradition is just it's not only corrupt, the naming convention for it is so difficult that like can we really refer, you can see under all of these revisions I have LXXMT, LXXMT, LXXMT. What it means is like it's considered the Septuagint. We call it Septuagint LXX. We call, basically if you find a manuscript that represents one of these, and these are present. If you see this green line goes all the way down into the New Testament tradition, you see we have Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus. A lot of these are reflecting these recensions, right? They're agreeing more with the Masoretic text in some places, and we call it Septuagint, even though it has the Masoretic text injected into it. It's been corrupted by it. So whether or not there are disputes online, and there could be somebody who jumps in the comments and says no, none of that's the Septuagint, right? You can't call it the Septuagint because Septuagint means 70, and because the only things that were translated by the 70 was this right here. This is the Septuagint proper. Everything else after that, the prophets, those aren't Septuagint. Those are just whatever. We don't have a name for it, right? So like those are just Greek translations of other Hebrew Bible, and that's just not how scholars refer to things, right? They call it all the Septuagint, and they call Baruch Septuagint, and they call Tobit and Judah, they call all of these other books that are included in the canon. They refer to the whole collection as the Septuagint, even though in some cases it's like these are not even translations. Like these are just original Greek writings that have been inserted into those collections and into that particular canon, that tradition.
Yeah, that's really fun. The fun thing that we're doing soon on the channel is I'm going to be interviewing a scholar on the Apocrypha. So we're going
Okay.
to dive all into the Greek text and the extra text of Daniel and all that fun stuff, Baruch and whatever. Yeah. So the last part, that if you didn't have anything else to add, there was the text of the Samaritan Pentateuch. So can you talk a little bit
Yeah,
about
so
that tradition?
obviously, yeah, so this is a really distinct tradition because it's the Samaritans who were up in the north. These are the sort of original descendants of the northern Israelites, very likely. There's obviously a conflict between the Judeans, the Jews, and the Samaritans that is reflected in the New Testament. And they have a separate, recension of the Hebrew of the Pentateuch only. So they don't have writings and prophets. They have a restrictive first 5 books of Moses. That is a distinct tradition that has affinities to the Septuagint. Like there are crossovers between that, which is why Emanuel thinks that they probably go back to the same common source.
Mhm.
It was introduced to the Western world in 1631, and it sparked theological debates about its age and accuracy because there are specific textual variants represented there that we don't find elsewhere, and that we think it goes back to a pre-Samaritan text type. And you can read more about it there. And it is not particularly well attested, right? Like we have the Proto-Samaritan Pentateuch, the Samaritan Pentateuch itself, which is a very interesting document. And then all the way over here, if you follow the line, you have the Abisha scroll, right? So this is 12th, 13th century, after the medieval Masoretic text, around the same period, right? So shortly after that. And then nowadays you have J. Morin's Samaritan Pentateuch edition that was first printed in the 17th century. So that is like, if you want a copy of the Samaritan Pentateuch, this is the one that you would need to look into.
Okay, so I'm not as familiar with the Samaritan Pentateuch. So what text do we have of that? You talked about it there, but so are you saying that we have we have Samaritan Pentateuch like text from the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? So that's
Mhm.
included,
Yeah.
but you also have another line that's ranged from 250 BC to like 50 BC.
Yeah, so
Or
the line that I have here, this is basically the idea of, if there was a proto-Samaritan Pentateuch, the version that we have that is
yeah,
reflected in this medieval manuscript here, right, that's reflected in the 12th and 13th century, that this is a copy of a source that's lost. That's a copy of a source that's lost. It's a copy of
yeah,
a source that's lost that goes all the way back to a version that was presumably composed somewhere around here,
hmm,
even though we don't have this, right? So we don't this right here. I should I'm revising this timeline, by the way. The new version will be out in a few days, that it'll have some modified formatting. So it should have a bold border because we don't, this is not a manuscript, right? The manuscript is that medieval one. This is a hypothesis. This is basically a date range going from 3rd century BC to 1st century BC of when we think that this particular recension of the Pentateuch that we call
yeah.
the Samaritan Pentateuch was composed,
Got it.
right?
Yeah.
Or
So
was copied from an earlier source with,
yeah,
like that when it came into its final form. This is when scholars think it came into its final form. And then the later copies reflect what this is right here.
yeah. So except for the Samaritan Pentateuch, the text that we see at the Dead Sea Scrolls, our text tradition for the Samaritan Pentateuch is pretty late.
Slim to none. Yeah, it's pretty late, and it's only the by virtue of the fact that we have Hebrew manuscripts and the Dead Sea Scrolls that represent that text type, we know that that text type was around at that time, right? So that's why we have this block here, because we do have manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls that attest to it. So we know that that tradition existed and that it somehow made its way to Qumran, and they were copying it, right? Like they had specific readings that went back to either this version or maybe back to this proto version, right? Like we just know that the 3rd, 2nd, 1st century BC and AD, like 1st century BC and AD, that sort of late Second Temple period was a time when it was kind of normal to have different Bible versions, right? Like it was not like, it just doesn't seem like anybody had any real issues with textual variants, right? And maybe the people who compiled the Judean Desert Scrolls, maybe they had a preference, but it's kind of undetectable. Like we just don't detect a preference. We know that the Pharisees probably had a preference for the Proto-Masoretic text, but Judaism, sort of in general, may not have had that any particular preference. And the point that Emanuel Tove makes a lot is that just because we find, like just because Jews in this period were using a specific form of the Bible doesn't necessarily indicate that they belong to a specific sect of Judaism. Later on, I think I think there was a sort of element of Hellenistic Judaism feeding into Christianity, where the early Christians did prefer that text, but that was a language thing. That was like, it's just because they spoke Greek, so they needed a Greek translation. And when their Greek translations, when they realized their Greek translations didn't agree with the Masoretic text, they just updated the Greek translations, not realizing that they were actually sort of erasing an older tradition.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. Okay, so I don't think we talked about what about the wasn't Origin, it was Jerome with the Latin text. Do you have that on here?
I do, yeah. So we're sort of, I mean, look, Jerome would be Old Testament and New Testament. The thing to point out about Jerome at the bottom of the timeline, right, is that Jerome was updating the old Latin translations of the Bible that were probably, originally made in the 3rd century AD, so pretty long time ago. He was working in the late 4th century AD, updating the Vetus Latina, Old Latin versions, into his version, but we don't have his version, right? So we speculate about, like our scholars speculate about what versions he was working with for his Old Testament and his New Testament, because he was a scholar who was able to translate from the original Greek and Hebrew. But all we have are later Bibles that represent the Vulgate. So we have this text right here that represents the Vulgate. We have this text here that represents Old Latin. We don't have, like, I can't connect the lines, right? I can't connect the dots from Jerome's Vulgate into later versions. I can simply note that in this sort of green I've labeled the Western text tradition, which we'll get into, as green. In this tradition, we have sort of what scholars deem to be good representatives of the Vulgate tradition that Jerome started, but we do not have Jerome's Vulgate.
We've been showing people a very small portion of the text. So you have the Apocrypha, the Tanakh, the Old Testament canon, and this is kind of what we've been talking about it up here. But there's a lot of New Testament text, just manuscripts that we really haven't gone into at all, and we won't go
Yeah.
too much into, but just the different uh, text types for the New Testament. And Stephen is just so really well done, detail for each different text. Now, of course, he doesn't have absolutely everything because there's like 5,000 different manuscripts that we have, but all the main ones.
It's worth noting that this timeline is just sort of a representative sample of major manuscripts, right? Like it's I could add some, like if somebody wants to point out like, oh, there's this like really important manuscript that you're missing. I'm always open to adding to it, but
Yeah.
it's not meant to be an exhaustive database. And also somebody in the comments mentioned it's a static file, so it is interactive. This is an embedded iframe element to a timeline that, yes, it is static, but it's interactive insofar as you can zoom in and out. You can hit Command F if you want to search for like Vulgate, right? That's probably what I should have been doing when I was looking for a Vulgate. You can hit Command F on a Mac, and you can type Vulgate, and you will find, yeah. So there's Vulgate. You can hit enter, and you can hit return and go to the next version, or hit those. Yeah. So there we go. Vulgate. So that's pretty interactive, right? You can make a case sensitive search. And there are all of those info tabs that you can click next to each box that opens up additional information. Or like, what's the Sixto Clementine Vulgate? You can read about it. I've actually created a storefront where you can buy a poster of it. And what I realized when I ran when I got my first few orders of the poster for the timeline was that it's way too wide. You can see that there's like a border on the top and the bottom, because when you try to print this on a standard poster, it didn't look very clean, right? So I ended up I'm redoing it so that it's poster size, so that when people do, if anybody wants a poster of this, I'm going to have various print formats, and I will have it be a standard poster size, so that there aren't these white spots in the bottom and the top. Because the first few people that bought them were like, oh, this is great, but there's white spots in the top and bottom, and the font is super small and like hard to read. So I'm fixing that. I'm making the font bigger, and I'm making it taller. So it's not going to be this wide. It's going to be taller. All the information is going to stay the same, but it is extremely time consuming. I'm literally going to every single thing, highlighting them all, making the font bigger, tweaking. So that's going to take me a little while. But when that's ready, I'm going to update it. You're going to see a new link. And if anyone orders a poster now, I will fill the order in the next week or so with the new version and not the old version.
Cool. So next thing here, I was hoping you would talk about the I guess the origin or the transmission of the KJV. So KJV is such a popular translation, but many are not familiar about, like, I guess where it comes from, the text behind it, and your timeline really does a great job showing that. So I know you have a slideshow for the KJV. What did you want to start with that, or just start with
Let's
the
start
chart?
with the slideshow just to kind of put faces to names.
Okay.
So we have Desiderius Erasmus, right? This was like a very, very, very influential scholar in the 16th, late 15th, early 16th century, who among his accomplishments, I mean, obviously there is the notorious Erasmian pronunciation system of Greek that everybody outside of Greece uses, basically to pronounce the Greek of the Bible and other forms of Greek and ancient Greek. And then you have his Novum Instrumentum Omni that he published first in 1516 and then in 1519. That was really just like absolutely, like, you can't minimize the effect that this had on later scholarship. It was like extremely monumental. He published the first edition in 1516. he rushed to print. And all 5 editions, which later were called the Novum Testamentum from 1519 to 1535, these were all published in Basel, Switzerland, in a printing house of one of his friends, Johann Froben. And really, I would characterize his whole thing, like Erasmus was really like an entrepreneur, in the sense that if you go to the next slide, you'll see the Complutensian polyglot.
I was just curious. So, is this a real picture of him? He looks like a Russian woman.
A portrait. Yeah, I mean, this is like one of the more famous portraits of him, but yeah, that's what he looked like. And
Oh wow.
I don't know if
Okay.
yeah. And then so on the next slide, you can see the Complutensian polyglot. If since Erasmus, his first edition came out in 1516, and what you'll notice is that the Complutensian polyglot was made from 1514 to 1517. And what a lot of people don't realize who haven't geeked out on this history and haven't watched my video on this, which I think is in the description, they didn't publish this until 1522, right? So, and they did the entire Bible in Hebrew and Greek and Latin with all of these different columns, trying to arrange everything. And the way that this is framed in a lot of the history that I think is the most compelling is that Erasmus got word about this project. And what he managed to do was to beat them to print. So this wasn't finished until 1516. They didn't have the money and the resources to print it until 1522, and the founder of the project died. And basically, Erasmus's Bible was like selling like hotcakes as soon as he printed in 1516. So going back, so now if you go to the timeline, I can sort of visualize this of basically the Textus Receptus tradition, the received text, the TR. That is what we refer to by the tradition that Erasmus began here, right? Erasmus's Greek New Testament in competition with the Complutensian polyglot, which was the Vulgate, the Septuagint, the Masoretic text, like all mushed together in this amazing format. And they did some these are scholars in Spain that did this amazing work. And Erasmus just sort of wiped the floor with them, right? Like he realized that if he just went to the local, churches and libraries in Switzerland, like in this one location, got together as many of the Greek the Greek manuscripts that he could find, and I have them marked on the timeline, so you can see the manuscripts used by Desiderius Erasmus and the Textus Receptus. They all have red lines pointing at Erasmus's Bible
Hey,
from
before you get into
these
that,
manuscripts.
can you go quickly show the KJV just to
Yeah, so
see?
if they're interested in the KJV, we don't have the KJV yet right here, right? So this is 16th century, right? This is like the 1500s, where we have these Bibles printed that are reconstructing the Greek, the original Greek, right? Or at least like from the Greek manuscripts. And the English Bible tradition that flows out of that is the Tyndale Bible. So Tyndale is the first English-speaking Bible translator to come along and take Erasmus, I think it was like his second or third edition of Erasmus, and translate that into English, right? So he did this between 1522 and 1535. He translates Erasmus's Greek into English, which then spawns these other derivative translations like Coverdale Bible, Matthew Bible, Geneva Bible, which then, in the Bishop's Bible derives from Geneva and Tyndale before, King James Bible comes along. The King James Bible is like, a later revision of Tyndale with influence from the Matthew Bible and the Bishop's Bible, but also it's sort of like downstream, right, from these earlier English versions. So it could be argued that the King James Bible wasn't necessarily, it was more of a revision than it was a translation, right? Because it's not like they were just ignoring the previous versions and going straight back to Erasmus or the later Textus Receptus tradition. But what this timeline represents is that the King James Bible and Tyndale and Geneva and Bishop's Bible and all of these, they are color coded with black text and a red background to indicate that they are in the Textus Receptus tradition going back to here. So you have Under this heading are modern English translations, right? So this is all English, right? Because we're English speaking world right here. But here, these are the Greek, right? These are the Greek that the English is based on, starting with Erasmus. There's a German Bible here too, which is the Luther Bible. Going from Erasmus to later revisions by Stephanus, by Beza, and by Elzevir. So this sort of chain right here, this gets you basically the culmination of this with the Elzevir Bible is what we call the received text, or the Textus Receptus, and the Elzevir Bible coins this term to basically refer to what scholars believed throughout this entire period. And we're talking like starting in the 17th century, or starting in the 16th century, going to the 17th and 18th centuries, all the way up until the 19th century. People just throughout the world, as soon as these Bibles hit the printing press, they were the first printed Bibles, right? And as soon as this tradition solidified itself at the culminating in the Elzevir Bible, all other Bibles after that were in Greek, and all of the revisions of the King James Bible that came, right? Because the King James Bible is basically, produced in 1611, revised in 1629, 1638, 1760, 1769. All of this is basically in deference to, in terms of the New Testament, right? Old Testament, Masoretic text, right? No question there. New Testament, Textus Receptus, right? Like that was considered the standard Bible at that time.
Fascinating. Okay, and I cut you off there. Did you have more you wanted to say there?
Well, everybody can explore this on their own. I'm just demoing, right? Like, so this is meant for people to kind of play around with. But if you go back through the timeline behind Erasmus and these red lines, I have included basically the manuscripts that Erasmus had access to. And remember, Erasmus was working in Basel, Switzerland, right? Like he went to one specific library. He imported a few other manuscripts, but the reason he gets a lot of flack, the reason people complain about Erasmus, other than the fact that he just rushed his first edition to print and was trying to beat the competency polyglot and just some shoddy scholarship, missing pieces of the Greek, translating from Latin. You can blame him all you want for his entrepreneurial spirit and trying to sort of be the first to market and sort of win this race with the competency and polyglot. He had access to basically those manuscripts that were available to him in Switzerland, minuscule 4, minuscule 5, minuscule 2. These are all late, right? These are all texts that date to the 12th and 13th centuries, for the most part. Like he had a few earlier ones, but these are the texts that he had access to in that particular location. If he weren't printing this Bible with his buddy in Switzerland, and if he were doing it in Italy or Venice or something, he would have had access to some other texts, right? And his Bible would have turned out differently. But he is basically taking on the text critical task. He's performing textual criticism on these manuscripts that he has access to. These Byzantine, fairly recent, probably in good condition when he handled them, fairly recent Byzantine manuscripts that we have copies of today that we can verify are transmitting for the most part. Like there are some exceptions. Like he had access to this minuscule in Family 1, which had a little bit slightly different textual profile than the majority of the other manuscripts that he did have access to 2814, 2815, minuscule 3, minuscule 2817. These ones were all like very consistent between themselves. Like they belong to what's called the Byzantine text type, or Byzantine family, which is basically a family that's represented in red here with white text, right? Erasmus's tradition is red with black text. The Byzantine text form that was perfected in the Byzantine Empire, this is red with white. That's what that symbolizes. And what we have here is a textual tradition. It's kind of akin to the Masoretic text in terms of the fact that if you were to take any random sample of a group of these manuscripts and compare them to each other, they're going to be over 90% the same. They're very, very, very consistent. Whereas we'll discuss this when we talk about textual families, but when you go into other families of New Testament texts, Then you get into differences in that are closer to like where you get more like 80% similarity as opposed to 90%. Like you have a significant sort of you have more significant textual variation.
Yeah, so I really like that the chart that you have, that you can really trace the sources of what they have. So there wasn't anything in your chart that that they're kind of missing as far as what sources they were tracking from. Like, what it doesn't the KJV, didn't they had multiple editions, so that maybe like the third or fourth edition had access to a little bit more text. Is that right?
Well, okay, so the KJV, or at least like English Bibles in general, when you're talking about Bible translations in the printed era, there's lots of revisions. They're revising the Greek text, but for the most part, once the Textus Receptus is finalized, like once it reaches its final form in the Elsevier Bible, which is very much just a slight revision of earlier traditions based on Erasmus. At that point, all of the printed Greek Bibles, we're talking about New Testament, right? Old Testament's fixed. Old Testament's done. Like it's baked, right? It's the Hebrew Masoretic text. The Greek New Testament was in flux until you get Erasmus and the Elsevier Bible. Like once they start getting printed, they get standardized very quickly. All of these later editions that you see, like Mill and Griesbach, and like they're printing the same text. They have different information in the textual apparatus that we'll go over, like the footnotes basically are different, but the text is all the same. And when you get into translations, if you're talking about all these editions of the King James Bible, they're not going back and finding new manuscripts and translating from manuscripts. They're translating from printed Bibles that are aligned up here. They're translating from, Beza, the Elsevier Bible, like insofar as they actually need to update their translations. Whether the extent to which that happened is probably debatable. I think for the most part they're just sort of revising, and if they go back and consult the original for any update in a new edition, they're consulting the printed Bibles that are printed up here, and they're consulting the Elsevier Bible. They're consulting the received text, right? Because at that time they had pretty much, and this is after the Protestant Reformation, which is really directly linked to this activity of revising the Bible and basically discarding the Latin Vulgate and saying, we now have access to the original text, right? Like, quote unquote, the original Bible, the Textus Receptus. And there are people today who believe that is, the King James Onlyus, or TR Onlyus. There are people who believe the Textus Receptus is, or at least it was as it was formulated in this period, that is the original. Right? And any other version, like if you get into modernity and we start looking at some of these newer Bible versions, right? All these Bibles are corrupt. They are not the King James Bible, right? Because the King James Bible is founded on a tradition that came into formation here, that was based on an earlier tradition that was extremely stable, extremely consistent. The Byzantine textual tradition of the Eastern Orthodox, of the Greek Orthodox Church. Even though the Elsevier Bible, I'm sort of explaining, as the culmination of this tradition started by Erasmus, and that the later Bibles that have this color code, they are essentially printing that text, but with an updated footnotes, right? Updated apparatus to show that they're starting to discover basically more and more of the textual tradition that Erasmus didn't have access to. Mm-hmm. And they're starting to realize, especially with like Griesbach, and then finally, when you get to Lockman, right? Lockman's Greek New Testament that I'm coloring in blue here, right? There is a break that happens where basically the previous generation of scholars, Scholz and like all these scholars, and Scrivener, who were the conservatives, right? The people who were really leaning on the Textus Receptus as the default standard. And this is up until the 19th century, right? So in the 19th century, there is a break. And that's the break that we'll talk about next time. And it's the subject of a video on Cross Bible if you want to link in the description. There is a break. There is a schism in the field of New Testament textual criticism, where scholars start regarding the Textus Receptus tradition as corrupt, as faulty, as basically based on that it's based on older, less reliable manuscripts, and people start making new discoveries of much, much older manuscripts, and they start basing their updated versions of the Greek Bible based on those. And that's what we'll save for another time. about how this transition happened, how this revolution happened in New Testament textual criticism, and how it is, and then how the modern period, like in the last 50 years, how that is even being overhauled further to get us to where we are today with our modern Bibles and
That's
future
really
Bibles,
awesome.
basically.
Yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, everybody go create an account, log in, support Steven if you can. It'd be much appreciated, and that would really help his progress as he's working on it. So, anything else you want to add left, Steven, or everybody go check out the description.
Yeah, I mean the whole goal, yeah, go sign up for Cross Bible. Registration is free. It doesn't unlock anything yet, but you're going to get some early bird access to some new features and perks. And then I have if you want to support me, I don't have a Patreon page. I have a billing page. So you go to Cross Bible Billing. You could kick me like $5 a month there or something if you can afford it. That's my de facto Patreon, because I'm just trying to make the software to offer to people for the purpose of comparing different Bible versions, but also for digging into the original version. So I have a very large collection of the Greek Bibles. And if you struggle with that, you can sign up for Biblingo through the affiliate link on my homepage. You get a 10% discount if you use the promo code CrossBible10. Or you can reach out to me with the contact form and we can arrange for a Greek lesson. So my schedule's filling up. My recent online activity has prompted a bunch of people to come take Greek lessons with me because they want to learn to read the Bible in the original in Greek. And so that is also something that would support me and support you in your journey into sort of digging deeper into the biblical text.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on, Steven.
All right. Thank you.